The rain had been falling hard that morning, the kind that hits the pavement in sharp, cold pinpricks. I was crouched beside the dumpster behind Bella's bakery, fingers numb, peeling back the plastic on a half-eaten croissant, when I heard the footsteps. Not skittish, not hurried, slow, precise, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who never had to rush for anything. I froze, crumbs sticking to my palms, my breath fogging the air in front of me. The man stepped into view, a tall figure in a navy overcoat, silver hair glistening with rain. He looked wildly out of place in that alley that smelled of yeast exhaust and broken pride. "Excuse me," he said, voice steady as a church bell. "Are you Harper Lane?" The world tightened around me, as if the moment itself was holding its breath. No one had spoken my name with intention in months. When I finally nodded, he offered a thin, knowing smile. "Your great-aunt passed away," he said, "and she left you $97 million. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Harper Lane. I'm 38 years old, and until about a year ago, I thought I had carved out a simple, decent life. I ran a small veterinary clinic tucked between a florist and a hardware store in a quiet Seattle neighborhood. It wasn't glamorous, but it smelled like lavender disinfectant and warm fur, and that always felt like home to me. I used to think compassion was something people admired. I used to think working late to save a stray or comforting an anxious pet owner meant something. But to my husband at the time, Eric Dalton, compassion didn't pay the mortgage. Kindness didn't polish a public image. To Eric, success looked like glossy cars and curated smiles, and the more I devoted myself to the clinic, the more he treated me like I was holding him back. His disappointment didn't come in shouts. It came in smaller, quieter ways, like the way he'd sigh when I walked in late still in scrubs, or how he'd remind me with a clipped smile that Jenna's husband just bought her a new Tesla, as if that was proof of a better kind of marriage. I learned to swallow those comments to tell myself he didn't mean them, that he was stressed, that this was temporary. But the truth is, Eric had been drifting away long before the night he left, and I had been shrinking myself just to keep the peace. Looking back, I think the clinic was the last part of me that still felt whole. It was my one place of purpose, a quiet corner of the world I'd built with my own two hands. And maybe that's why losing it hurt even more than losing him. The day the bank foreclosed after Eric drained our joint account without a warning call or a single ounce of shame, I stood on the sidewalk watching a man scrape my name off the front window. My reflection blurred in the glass, and for a moment it felt like my entire identity was being peeled away stroke by stroke. I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. My mother offered her spare room down in Portland, but she was recovering from surgery, and the last thing I wanted was to show up there like a weight she didn't need to carry. So I stayed in Seattle, first in my car, then wherever I could find a corner to curl into. I kept telling myself that the world would straighten out if I just held on a little longer. But the world didn't notice, not when my car broke down, not when the cold nights turned my breath into ghostly clouds, not when I stood in line at shelters, only to find the beds full. People say homelessness happens slowly and then all at once. They're right. One day you're a homeowner with a savings account, and the next you're learning which dumpsters hold the freshest discarded bread. You stop being seen. You stop being spoken to. You start disappearing not in a single moment, but in a long, quiet fade. The worst part wasn't the hunger. It was the silence. The way people walked past me with polite avoidance, as if making eye contact might turn them to stone. I whispered to myself in those nights, "Just one more day, Harper. One more day." I didn't know who I was, convincing me or the cold air. I had no idea that someone somewhere had been tracking my fall. Someone who knew my name, my story, my failures. Someone who believed my life was about to collide with a truth so strange it didn't feel real when it finally arrived. Because on that cold November morning behind the bakery, where I had learned to make a meal out of scraps, a man in an immaculate suit spoke my name, and everything I thought I knew about my life, my worth, and my future shifted in the space of a single breath. And that was only the beginning. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine needles that Christmas morning, but none of that warmth softened the sting in my chest. I remember standing in the living room doorway, clutching the gift I had saved my allowance for a little ceramic dog I painted myself, waiting for my father to notice me. My younger brother Dylan was tearing open the wrapping paper on a brand new bicycle, my mother cheering, my father beaming with pride. I stepped forward, hopeful, ready. But when my father finally looked at me, it wasn't with pride or even acknowledgement. It was annoyance. "Move back, Harper," he murmured, shifting me aside so he could get an unobstructed picture of Dylan with his bike. My little ceramic dog slipped from my hand and cracked against the floor. But no one turned. No one even heard it over Dylan's laughter. I stood there invisible while the world celebrated around me. The memory still has a sharp edge to it even now, as if it happened just yesterday. It took years before I understood that moment wasn't isolated. It was a beginning, a quiet blueprint for the way I learned to exist in the background of other people's lives. Growing up in Portland, we weren't wealthy, but my parents worked hard to give us stability. My mother was gentle, overwhelmed most days, but loving in the way she could manage. My father, though, he had a way of seeing Dylan as the sun in the center of the family's orbit, and the rest of us simply moved around him. Dylan was loud, charming, reckless, everything my father admired. I was quieter, happier with books and animals than with attention. And because I didn't demand much, no one offered much. I didn't realize how deeply that shaped me until adulthood. Even in elementary school, the pattern followed. The teacher would ask who wanted to take home the class rabbit for winter break. Every hand shot up, but mine I knew I wouldn't win. When she chose Dylan instead after he bragged that Dad says animals listen to me, I just nodded as if it made sense. I was the kind of child who learned early that disappointment didn't need to be dramatic. It could be quiet, almost polite. By middle school, I had found refuge in the stray animals that wandered near our neighborhood. I built makeshift shelters from old boxes, fed them scraps, named them, loved them. My father would shake his head, muttering that I was wasting time on creatures that contributed nothing. Dylan would laugh when he saw me trying to coax a frightened cat out from under the shed, calling me the backyard doctor. The words stung, but I never fought back. Silence felt safer than being mocked for trying. And then there were the holidays. Every Thanksgiving, my father would gather the extended family around the table, telling stories of Dylan's sports trophies, his near-perfect batting average, his future scholarship potentials. When the conversation drifted my way, it was always the same line: "Harper's our quiet one." A tagline, a description that covered everything and explained nothing. I would smile, pretending the phrase didn't shrink me a little more each time it was spoken. But maybe the clearest example came senior year of high school. I earned an academic scholarship, my own accomplishment, independent of anyone else. I remember presenting the letter to my parents after dinner, heart pounding with pride. My mother smiled and hugged me, but my father only said, "That's good, Harper. Maybe now you can be as driven as your brother." Dylan had just been cut from his college baseball prospects after an injury, and my news felt more like an inconvenience than something worth celebrating. I folded the scholarship letter and slipped it into my pocket, telling myself that pride was best kept quiet anyway. It's strange looking back how easy it was to adapt to the shadows, how natural it became to shrink to make myself small so others wouldn't sigh or roll their eyes or tell me I was too sensitive. I learned to shoulder everyone else's needs, to apologize, even when nothing was my fault, to work harder than anyone but speak less than everyone. There's a particular ache that forms when your worth is consistently measured by how little trouble you make. You start believing that if you stay quiet enough, invisible enough, maybe someone will notice the effort and offer a place for you. But they rarely do. Those patterns of being overlooked followed me straight into adulthood like threads stitched into the lining of my life. When I met Eric in my late 20s, I mistook his attention for admiration. He was polished, articulate, confident in ways that made me feel chosen simply by standing at his side. He praised my calmness, my gentleness, the way I didn't make everything about myself the way he said so many women did. I didn't realize he meant it as a compliment only when it benefited him. At first, I thought we balanced each other, his ambition and my compassion. But slowly, subtly, he shaped our life around his image. I was the steady one, the supportive one, the one who didn't rock the boat. And I fell right into the role because it felt familiar. It was the same script I'd lived since childhood. When he compared me to other wives who dressed better, earned more, spoke less, I internalized those comparisons as expectations. If I only tried harder, I thought I could be enough. If I only stayed quiet and patient, maybe he'd look at me the way he looked at success. I mistook his disapproval for guidance. I mistook his neglect for a chance to improve myself. That is how deep past wounds can run. They distort what feels normal, what feels deserved, what feels possible. It wasn't until much later, long after he drained our accounts and left without a second glance, that I recognized the truth. Eric didn't break me. He simply stepped into the space my upbringing carved out and made himself comfortable. Even after I lost the clinic, after I slept in my car, even as the cold air crept under the door frame of every shelter I couldn't get into, part of me believed I somehow earned that downfall. I replayed old memories, each one confirming the same message: you don't take up space. Harper, you endure. But endurance has a way of turning into erasure. On the street, a different kind of silence settled in. People passed without looking, just as my family once had. The world doesn't see what it has already decided isn't worth seeing. Some nights I tried to recall the sound of someone saying my name with genuine care, and I couldn't. Not for a long time. And that kind of emptiness leaves echoes that linger. But the strange thing about wounds is that they don't remain hidden forever. They rise, they resurface, sometimes in ways you never expect. Because on that cold November morning behind Bella's bakery, when Harold Whitman spoke my name with purpose, something shifted, not just in the present, but deep in the layers of my past. It was as if every dismissal, every overlooked moment, every quiet ache suddenly aligned into a single point of clarity. Something was about to break open. Something long buried. Something I was finally going to face. I just didn't know yet that the truth waiting ahead would unravel far more than my pain. It would expose the reason someone had been watching my life from afar, waiting for the precise moment I hit the bottom, just before offering me a way to rise. The screen flickered once, before settling into a soft glow, and for a moment all I could hear was the hum of the penthouse's heating system. Then Evelyn's face appeared, steady eyes, silver hair pulled back, lips pressed tight, as though the weight of her own secret sat behind them. I leaned in, barely breathing, as her recorded voice filled the study. But just as I braced myself for her message, another image flashed beside her rows of documents, photographs, transaction histories. They weren't part of any will reading. They looked like surveillance files. One photo was of me locking up my old clinic. Another was of me sleeping in my car. The next was worse me on the sidewalk behind the bakery holding a piece of stale bread with shaking hands. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Then Evelyn's voice said, almost as if speaking directly over my shoulder, "If you're watching this, Harper, it means you've finally reached the bottom." I stood, frozen eyes locked on the screen, as file after file scrolled across it. Pictures, notes, timeline entries, emails addressed to someone I didn't recognize, a ledger with my name circled. It all washed over me in a flood I couldn't step out of. The room felt smaller, tighter. Every page that flicked past held a piece of my life I didn't know anyone else had ever seen. I didn't understand what I was seeing at first, not until I forced myself to look closer. Evelyn Hart hadn't just left me an inheritance. She had been documenting my descent long before I realized I was falling. And she wasn't the only one who knew. When the screen finally paused and her message resumed, everything inside me felt suddenly, painfully awake. For a long time, I didn't move. It was as though the air in that room had thickened, making every breath feel like pulling against a tide. It's a strange thing to discover your life has been quietly observed while you were drowning, but stranger still to realize that someone predicted it. And stranger yet to learn that the person who ruined you, your ex-husband, had been positioned to profit from it. I stepped back from the desk, gripping the edge as the shock settled into my bones. What I saw there changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about my past. Evelyn's face softened again as the video continued, but my eyes kept flicking toward the documents displayed beside her. In the video's quiet glow, I saw pieces of a puzzle I had never been meant to solve on my own. As the screen darkened to black, the entire penthouse fell silent, almost reverent, like the house itself was waiting to see what I would do with what I had learned. The shock didn't fade. It deepened. That day, sitting in that immaculate Manhattan study, I understood that the truth wasn't simply that I had inherited money. It was that my collapse and my ex-husband's lurking presence was no accident in Evelyn's eyes. She believed all of it mattered. She believed it revealed who I had become. And now she expected me to rise with full awareness of how far I had fallen. I sank slowly into the leather chair in front of the desk, my hands trembling. The evidence laid bare on the screen was staggering. Everything I had survived, every humiliation, every night alone, had been witnessed by someone I had never even met. Someone who understood that my pain didn't begin on the streets, but years before, woven into the tight seams of my life. Page after page on the screen mapped out the unraveling of my marriage. There were financial statements showing the slow draining of our accounts, small withdrawals at first, then larger ones, all leading to the final wipeout. There were emails between Eric and a brokerage partner where he hinted at reallocating personal assets without my knowledge. My name appeared in those messages like an afterthought, or worse, like collateral. I blinked hard, barely able to swallow. I remembered the arguments with Eric near the end, the subtle shifts in his mood, the way he dismissed my questions, the way he looked at me with that tight-lipped impatience he saved for things he found tedious. I'd thought then that I was being too sensitive, that his frustration was normal, that I was the problem again. I had been trained for years to believe that. But reading his words on the screen, seeing how he'd discussed me like a financial liability, made something hot and sharp twist in my chest. And then the photographs with timestamps. They didn't lie. The night I slept behind the clinic after being locked out for the first time. The day I walked to the bank only to discover my account empty. The weeks I camped in my car outside the community center. The morning I showed up at the shelter and was told all the beds were gone. Someone, Evelyn, or someone working for her, had tracked it all. But nothing hit me harder than the page listing my ex-husband's full legal record. Not the past I knew, the past I didn't. There were advisories from financial ethics boards, records of investigations he had narrowly escaped thanks to insufficient evidence, ties to clients whose portfolios mysteriously collapsed while his own balance rose. My name appeared occasionally, usually attached to accounts tied to our marriage accounts he controlled. He had built his career on being the charming, polished advisor with a smile as glossy as the brochures he handed out. But behind it was rot, and I had never seen it, not because it wasn't there, but because he had never let me get close enough to it. And then there was the note from Evelyn herself, typed neatly at the bottom of one document. She doesn't know what he did. She doesn't know what he took. She doesn't know who he became. My breath hitched. For years, I had blamed myself for the collapse of our life, for not being ambitious enough, driven enough, for clinging too much to the work I loved. I internalized every cutting remark he threw my way, every comparison he made to women he claimed were more deserving. But seeing it there in black and white, I realized the truth. Eric had been dismantling our life long before he walked out the door. My failures had been manufactured. My downfall was his strategy. The worst betrayal wasn't that he left me. It was that he'd been preparing to leave me with nothing. The screen shifted again to something I didn't expect, a small folder labeled Alternate Beneficiary. My heart pounded as I clicked it. There it was. A single page confirming that if I declined the inheritance or failed Evelyn's condition, the entire estate penthouse accounts, properties, investments would transfer to Eric Dalton. The man who had drained me dry would be rewarded if I didn't rise. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a test, not of morality, no, of character, of strength, of whether I would stay down or claw my way back. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to breathe through the dizzying storm of anger and clarity swirling through me. All my life I had been conditioned to accept crumbs, to stay small, to keep peace, to avoid making anyone uncomfortable. I had mistaken endurance for grace. But as I sat there surrounded by documents that exposed the truth of my past, I felt something shift inside me, something long dormant but fiercely alive. It wasn't rage, though. Anger pulsed under every breath. It was resolve. Resolve not to be silent anymore. Resolve not to let Eric rewrite the ending of my story again. Resolve to honor the faith Evelyn had placed in me, not as a charity case, but as someone capable of transforming pain into purpose. I closed the laptop gently, almost reverently, as though sealing away the final piece of a puzzle that had been years in the making. For the first time in a long while, I stood tall in the center of a room that had once intimidated me. The city lights outside the floor-to-ceiling windows glittered like 1,000 watchful witnesses waiting for me to make my next move, and I knew exactly what that move would be. I would not allow my ex-husband to claim one more piece of my life. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me falter. I would not let the truth I'd uncovered drown me. No, this time, the truth would be my armor. I walked toward the elevator, the letter from Evelyn clutched in my hand. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and I stepped inside, feeling the weight of everything I had learned settle into something sharp and steady. Because whatever came next, whatever fight was brewing on the horizon, would not catch me unaware. I had seen enough, I knew enough, and for the first time I felt ready. As the elevator doors closed, sealing me into that small, reflective space, I whispered to myself, not as a plea, but as a promise. This ends with me. The conference room fell silent the moment I pressed the remote, and the lights dimmed to a soft glow across the polished mahogany table. Eric froze mid-smirk, his hand still resting on the back of the chair like he owned the room. 20 people, board members, auditors, donors, watched as the screen behind me flickered to life. His name appeared first, then mine. Then a series of bank statements I had waited months to reveal. Someone in the room gasped when the first withdrawal showed up, 6 figures pulled from our joint account months before our divorce without my signature. I clicked again and audio filled the room. Eric's voice clear as crystal saying, "She won't notice. She never does." Chairs creaked, eyes widened. And before he could lunge toward me, I laid the final document on the table, proof that he had used my identity to open a shadow account the year our marriage collapsed. Now every person in the room was staring at him, and he knew exactly what I had just done. But let me bring you to the road that led us to this moment, because none of it happened by accident. By the time I uncovered the trail Evelyn left behind, I understood that confronting Eric in private would achieve nothing. Men like him don't feel shame unless there's an audience. They don't crumble unless the spotlight finds them, unless every mask they've worn slips at once. For years, he thrived on the illusion that he was the reasonable one, the composed one, the successful one. I had no intention of letting him hide behind that image ever again. The hearing he initiated his challenge to the inheritance became the perfect stage. He expected to corner me to portray me as some fragile woman who stumbled into a fortune she didn't deserve, a charity case, a fluke, and he counted on the same silence I had given him our entire marriage. What he didn't know was that I was no longer the woman he could mold, mute, or manage. Harold helped me gather everything records Evelyn kept, financial statements she preserved, even archived emails that his own arrogance had left unprotected. Maya spent nights sorting through files, color-coding timelines, helping me fit together the pieces of a life I once couldn't bear to examine. When the court announced a mediation day, attended by board members and advisors from the foundation, Eric assumed it would be his victory lap. I knew it would be his undoing. So I walked into that room with a folder that felt heavier than any briefcase, heavier than any burden I had carried during my darkest years. Not because of the paper inside it, but because of the truth it represented and the ending it promised. Eric was already there, lounging in his chair, tapping his gold watch, as if measuring the seconds until I walked in. His new girlfriend sat beside him, legs crossed, eyes bored. She didn't know anything, and I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "You're late," Eric announced when I stepped inside. "Not a good look when you're defending millions of dollars you didn't earn." I set my folder on the table, leveled my voice, and said, "Let's begin." The room quieted with the kind of anticipation that feels like a held breath, and that's when I decided to start with the audio. When the recording came through the speakers, his voice smug and unfiltered, Eric's expression shifted in a slow collapse. First confusion, then recognition, then alarm. "That's not Harper that's taken out of context," he snapped, turning to the room as if expecting agreement. But no one spoke. Not yet. I pressed another button, and the next set of evidence appeared. This time it was numbers precise, undeniable numbers. His withdrawals, his secret account, his signature forging mine, his transfer of funds in the months leading up to our divorce. "This is fabricated," he insisted, voice louder, more brittle. "She's twisting things. She always twists things." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The room was doing the unraveling for me. But the twist, the moment everything turned in my favor, was still waiting. Harold cleared his throat, signaling for the floor. "Mr. Dalton," he said calmly, "would you like to explain why the IP address associated with these transfers belongs to your office at Sterling and Weston Financial?" The color drained from Eric's face. Someone in the back coughed. Another whispered, "Oh my God!" Eric jerked upright. Anyone could have used my computer. But that's when I placed the next sheet of paper on the table. A printed email, from him, to a private banker, using my name, my social security number, my old clinic address, my identity. He had siphoned money not only to starve our marriage, but to prepare for a life I would never be part of, a life built on a foundation of hidden accounts carrying my name, so that when they crashed, the blame would fall on me. That was the twist I had been saving. I watched several people recoil. One woman covered her mouth. A man at the end of the table leaned forward, whispering urgently to his colleague. But what happened next shifted everything. Harold pressed a key, and the video Evelyn had recorded months before her death filled the screen. Not the first message, the second one, the one she left specifically for this kind of betrayal. Evelyn's face appeared older and frailer than in the private recording at the penthouse, but her eyes still sharp. "If you're watching this," she began, "someone is questioning Harper's integrity. Someone who believes wealth is a reward for manipulation and cruelty. Someone who thinks the world revolves around those who take rather than those who give." Eric tried to stand, but the room collectively watched him sit back down. "I knew there would be an attempt," Evelyn continued, "because I watched the man who married my niece strip her of everything good she built. I witnessed him exploit her kindness, her trust, and her silence, and I made certain those actions would not be rewarded." The room was dead still. I leave this message to say, any challenge made by Mr. Dalton is to be considered void. His history of financial misconduct is well documented. His attempts to drain her assets were deliberate, and if he is in this room, he should leave it knowing he no longer has the power to take anything from her again. The screen went dark. You could have heard a pin drop. Then someone whispered, "My God." She knew. And someone else said, "This is fraud. This is actual fraud." Eric's hands started to shake. "This is all planned. This is all she's manipulating you. She manipulated everyone. You don't know what she's capable of." But his panic only hardened the truth. One by one, the faces in the room shifted from confusion to horror to sympathy, but not for him. For me. Harold finally stood. "Mr. Dalton," he said evenly, "based on this evidence, your claim not only fails but raises serious legal concerns. Concerns that we will be forwarding to the appropriate authorities." Eric's voice cracked. "Harold, you know me. You've known me for years. Don't do this." Harold's face remained still unreadable. "I know who you pretended to be." The room reacted like a tide, shifting slow at first, then unstoppable. His girlfriend quietly slid away from him. One board member stood and walked out. Another muttered, "We should have seen it." And for the first time in my life, I watched Eric Dalton lose the one thing he prized more than money control. He lunged toward the table, grabbing the evidence, crumpling it, as if tearing paper could erase truth. "You think you're better than me?" he hissed. "You think anyone would believe you without this old woman's money propping you up?" I looked him straight in the eyes. "No," I said softly. "They believe me now because the truth finally speaks louder than you do." The room was holding its breath again. I gathered my folder, slid it under my arm, and pushed back my chair. The legs scraped gently against the floor, a quiet sound, but in that stillness it echoed like a closing chapter. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. That wasn't who I wanted to be. Instead, I said just one thing. "You don't get to write my story anymore." and I walked out, leaving the room filled with murmurs, stunned silence, and the shattered pieces of Eric's last attempt to own me. Behind me, I heard his voice calling my name, panicked, desperate, small, but I didn't turn around. Not anymore, because that moment wasn't about anger. It was about ending the long, heavy shadow of a man who had taken everything he could, and stepping finally into whatever waited for me next. When I stepped out of that conference room, the air in the hallway felt strangely light, as if the walls themselves had released a long-held breath. My footsteps echoed softly on the polished floor, each one carrying me farther from the chaos I'd just left behind. There was no cheering, no sense of triumph, just a deep, steady quiet, the kind that settles in after a storm has finally passed. I felt the tension in my shoulders loosen for the first time in years. The weight of old shadows. Eric's voice, his control, the years of silence seemed to fall away behind me. By the time I reached the lobby's glass doors, the city felt different too. The traffic still hummed, the crowd still moved, but the world felt less heavy, as if something inside me had shifted into place at last. The thing about truth is that once it's spoken out loud, it doesn't go back into hiding. In the weeks that followed, the legal dust settled quickly. Eric's challenge collapsed exactly as Evelyn predicted, and the courts finalized the transfer of her estate entirely into my name. But reclaiming what was mine didn't happen with a single ruling. It unfolded in quiet, deliberate moments. I remember the first night I stepped back into Evelyn's penthouse after everything was over. The city lights spilled across the marble floor like a soft glow, and I walked room to room, touching the cool surfaces, letting the space become something more than inheritance. It became a home I could choose on my terms. There was something healing about the small acts opening the windows to let the cold Manhattan air rush in, sweeping away the thin layer of dust that had gathered on the bookshelves, choosing new sheets for the guest rooms, and rearranging the living area so it felt less like a museum and more like a place where people might actually sit and talk. I spent an afternoon pruning the plants Evelyn had cared for, trimming away the brittle stems until fresh green showed through. It reminded me of tending to animals at my old clinic, how tending to something fragile helped me feel steadier myself. Some parts of reclaiming my life happened more quietly still. When Eric tried to reach out voicemails full of excuses, half-formed apologies, and thinly veiled pleas for another chance, I didn't reply. I didn't block him either. I simply let the messages pass through weightless, unable to touch me anymore. Cutting ties didn't require dramatic declarations. It required distance. Calm, firm distance. And in that distance, I found space to breathe. My relationship with my own family grew clearer too. My mother called one evening, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I saw the news," she whispered, "and I want you to know I'm proud of you." Her words carried no judgment, no comparison to the past, only a mother's quiet recognition. We didn't talk about the years I felt overshadowed or overlooked. We didn't need to. Sometimes healing comes not from reopening old wounds, but from allowing something gentle to grow in their place. At the foundation, life moved forward with its own rhythm. Maya became a force of her own, leading programs, mentoring new arrivals, showing a steadiness I had once only dreamed of finding in myself. Together, we expanded the housing project in Queens and opened 2 additional support centers staffed by women who had once walked the same difficult roads. I watched them greet newcomers with understanding rather than pity, offering handshakes instead of charity. That mattered to me. Evelyn didn't save me so I could save others. She gave me a chance so I could help them save themselves. One moment stands out even now. I remember unlocking the doors to a converted brownstone in Brooklyn, the building we planned to use for long-term housing. The sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating the scuffed floors and bare walls. It looked worn, forgotten, overlooked. A younger version of me would have seen only the cracks. But now I saw potential, healing, a place that could hold hope. I rolled the first coat of paint across the living room wall myself, soft cream, warm and steady. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline, I had paint in my hair and streaks on my clothes, but something in me felt newly anchored. It wasn't just a building I was restoring. It was a version of myself I once believed was gone. Some evenings after the workday ended and the city hummed with its restless energy, I would sit in the penthouse study where Evelyn recorded her messages. I kept her final handwritten letter framed on the desk. The ink had faded slightly, but the meaning remained strong. Giving is how the broken heal. I read those words often, not because I needed instruction, but because they reminded me that none of this journey was meant to be easy, and none of it had been in vain. The foundation flourished. Women found jobs, homes, reunions with children, new beginnings they once believed were impossible. I saw it in their faces, the shift from fear to steadiness, from shame to pride. And every time one of them walked across a small stage at our graduation events, holding her certificate with trembling hands, I felt something inside me mend a little more. But the moment I knew my life had truly changed happened on an ordinary evening in late autumn. I was heading back to the penthouse when I noticed a young woman sitting on the steps outside, thin coat backpack clutched to her chest, eyes wary and exhausted. She reminded me of myself in ways that stopped me cold. I approached slowly, the same way I would have approached a frightened animal years ago. "You all right?" I asked quietly. She nodded, then shook her head. I just don't know where to go." For a heartbeat, the world felt perfectly still. "Come with me," I said gently. "We'll get you somewhere safe." She hesitated, studying my face for any sign of judgment or pity. When she found none, she let out a small breath and stood. Her name was Lily, and she had come to New York chasing a job that vanished before she arrived. I brought her to the new brownstone, the one we had painted, repaired, filled with warmth, and watched her expression soften as she stepped inside. A single act of kindness had once changed the course of my great-aunt's life. Another had changed mine. And now, without fanfare or grand gestures, I passed that same kindness forward. As the days settled into a new rhythm, I found myself waking each morning with a steadiness I hadn't known in years. My life was no longer defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I could build slowly, intentionally, and with people who believed in something greater than themselves. And in quiet moments, standing at the penthouse window overlooking the city, I understood something I hadn't before. Healing isn't a single moment or a dramatic turning point. It's a series of small choices, choosing peace over chaos, truth over silence, purpose over fear. It's choosing every day to become the person you needed when your world first fell apart. And now, as I look at the life I am still building, I carry one simple truth with me. Some losses break you open so that light has a way in.